Welcome to the Rise Above Project. I'm your host, Joe Perroni. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, champion bodybuilder, and I've been a personal trainer for about 30 years. This podcast is about helping people with their emotional, spiritual, and physical fitness. I value strength, toughness, and truth. I despise complacency, the victim mentality, and following the herd. If you find my work to be valuable, please subscribe to my channel and tell a friend.
Today, I want to talk about legitimate suffering versus needless suffering. I also want to highlight Jordan Peterson's rehab story to illustrate a few points. And don't worry if you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, because you will still understand the points that I'm going to make. The first noble truth of Buddhism is life is suffering. In Dr. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, the first three words are, "Life is difficult." And Arnold Schwarzenegger said, "Having the guts to go through your pain is what makes a champion." If there is one concept that sages, gurus, religious leaders, athletes, and philosophical leaders agree with, it's this: life is suffering. Disagreeing, numbing, or being willfully ignorant of this fundamental truth will cause more suffering. Without the awareness that we are all finite creatures who will experience pain, we are subject to procrastination, unfulfilled dreams, and are subject to scratching and clawing against the realities of life. Successfully managing pain and discomfort is a prerequisite to being a person of esteem and ultimate value. Now, this doesn't mean that life is nothing but suffering and difficulty. It does mean that we have to understand the realities of life while we fight to create meaning and happiness. It also means that through skillful living, we can accept and look forward to legitimate suffering as a necessary rite of passage to becoming a conscious, competent human being. We will also have to develop the psychological strength to eliminate needless suffering and to never sabotage ourselves or our loved ones. Let me be clear about looking forward to legitimate suffering. Legitimate suffering is a gift because you can't feel suffering and grief without first having strong emotions of love, care, and attachment. The depth of suffering and grief is directly related to the depth of the shared love and attachment. Not everyone is fortunate to have people in their life who are worthy of intense love and attachment. Therefore, the feelings of grief and suffering are a realization of a person's good fortune. Legitimate suffering should be flavored with bittersweet, not despair. And I agree with Nietzsche, who says, "Suffering provides the only test by which a person's worth can be determined. The person who can endure the greatest suffering is the greatest of men." A fundamental truth is that all good things come to an end. But it's also true that it's not just the good things. All things come to an end. So it's better to be grateful for having the good in life because it is never a guarantee. One way to eliminate needless suffering is to live in a way that is congruent with nature and understand that everything has a cost. If you want to play, you have to pay. Suffering and disappointments can't be minimized by living a life of irresponsibility and withdrawal from meaningful contact. Living an unconscious life with no purpose or challenge multiplies the suffering for the individual and any of the unfortunate souls in his or her perimeter. If the universe blesses you with love and connection, then throwing a tantrum, acting entitled, and depending on drugs when it ends is an unskillful and disrespectful response. Nothing is permanent. All marriages end. About 50% end in divorce. The other 50% end in death. So live in the moment. Be grateful for what you have. And when it ends, be grateful that you at least had something to miss or to be sad about. Everything in the universe balances out. Everything blooms and dies. But it's always better to be a fallen king than to never have been a king at all. A heart that loves will be a heart that bleeds, and a heart that expands from the smell of roses will recoil from the stab of thorns. Those who don't want to accept these truths should never be in a relationship, never have children, never have dogs, and never attempt to accomplish anything, because there will be suffering in anything worthwhile. The meaning of life is to suffer well. To do that, one needs to understand the difference between legitimate suffering and needless suffering. Carl Jung said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Neuroticism, or emotional instability in the form of anxiety and depression, which is needless suffering, can manifest when choosing not to face reality and truth. Needless suffering also arises from not living up to your potential and being your best self every second of every day. Life is a never-ending series of problems and obstacles that all humans have the choice to challenge or to ignore. To have any chance at solving these problems, Dr. Scott Peck says, we must take the initiative to accept legitimate suffering in the form of delayed gratification, accepting full responsibility, the dedication to truth in words and deeds, and to balance conflicting requirements. Deviation from this legitimate suffering and not accepting the reality of impermanence and struggle will lead to needless suffering. Jordan Peterson is a psychologist who has become incredibly famous and influential. He is a college professor who many consider to be the voice of this generation. He has millions of YouTube subscribers and has a best-selling book entitled The 12 Rules for Life. Depending on his tour schedule, he is estimated to be making between $600,000 to $800,000 per month, not year, per month. Recently, he's been in the news due to voluntarily admitting himself into a drug rehab because of a physical dependence to Klonopin. Klonopin, or clonazepam, is a benzodiazepine that is used to treat anxiety and panic attacks. This psychotropic medication was prescribed to him to help alleviate anxiety, stemming from his inability to cope with his wife's cancer diagnosis and surgery. This is in addition to the Wellbutrin and an SSRI he was prescribed to help him cope with depressive symptoms. Concerning his use of antidepressants, Jordan Peterson says, and I quote, "I will never stop taking these, ever," unquote. At this time, his wife appears to be recovering at home with their daughter while he is still in rehab. Now, this is obviously a sad story. Anytime an individual or family comes face to face with a life-threatening disease such as cancer, everyone involved needs our empathy and understanding. This extends far past the Peterson family. This includes the 15.3 million Americans currently living with cancer, everyone affected by the 1.8 million new cases of cancer in 2019 alone, and all those who have been affected by those who are still fighting or those who have passed on. As a marriage and family therapist and as a human being, I have empathy and compassion for my clients and everyone I meet. However, in order to be effective, my job is not to help people feel better about their destructive thoughts and behaviors. It is to help people do better with their thoughts and behaviors. Many times this will decrease my financial worth because more people prefer to feel better than to do the difficult but necessary work to do better. However, it doesn't increase my self-worth as long as I continue to practice with integrity and intellectual honesty. I believe that in order to move through life with integrity, one must experience it fully and not run away or mask reality in any fashion. It's always better to be fully conscious and respect the facts of life instead of living in willful ignorance, denial, or being tethered to an obsolete identity. Responding effectively in thoughts and behaviors, no matter what the hardship, difficulty, or the level of suffering, demonstrates mastery over life and validates the soul more than money or applause ever could. Legitimate suffering creates a legacy. Jordan Peterson's story is a cautionary tale. All of the fame, money, and accolades has not shielded him from the realities of life. Self-esteem can be defined as one's estimate of their ability to cope with life's challenges. Jordan Peterson's insistence that he would never face life without at least 2 antidepressant medications is an admission that he is ill-equipped to cope with the difficulties of life. I'm not against utilizing medications as a bridge to health, but it should not be a lifestyle. The prognosis of relying on medications to deal with the stresses of life is continued, gradual weakness. By definition, he doesn't have sufficient self-esteem. In his lectures, he denies the concept of self-esteem, which is another way of denying his reality. You can't fix a problem if you can't admit to it. Jordan Peterson's wife having cancer is an extremely difficult situation, but that did not cause him to start taking Klonopin. He willingly chose to take psychotropic medications while knowing about the side effects due to his inability to cope with the normal stresses of life. And yes, he became physically dependent on them, but it was his psychological weakness that led him to be dependent. This needless suffering is magnified because his child and especially his wife need a strong, stable, masculine force to help them through this difficult time. And they don't have one. This supposed guru who delights in telling inexperienced young adults to set their own house in order before they are allowed to even have an opinion is sitting in a drug rehab while his wife is trying to recover from cancer and healing from a surgery. He is useless and weak to his family at this point. To make matters worse, the spotlight is on him and not on his ailing wife, because his family is worried about his well-being. His own daughter described him as a lost puppy dog, and yet he is not the one with the cancer. His new challenge, which has been made infinitely worse due to his inability to accept legitimate suffering, is self-inflicted and needless, but will no doubt get him the external validation he so craves. Social esteem is a poor substitute for authentic self-esteem. Needless suffering always brings more needless suffering. And this is what happens when you have a psychologist who is credentialed, but is not educated about life. Too much time with his head in a book, and not enough time being courageous in life and trying to overcome his own deficiencies. He's typical of many mental health clinicians who have gone to school to learn about psychology, but has never been successful in any other area of his life. Daily action and competition in the real world and being a success in business and athletics is where the real lessons are learned. Building self esteem, working through negative feelings, and looking at obstacles as gifts rather than burdens can only be learned in the crucible of competition and in gladiatorial forums. Studying statistics from the bleachers is not the same as competing in the arena. Jordan Peterson is hypocritical and does not practice what he preaches. At this time, he can't perform like the alpha male he always preaches about. This is because he has book knowledge of what an alpha male is, but has never lived like one. I have never known a true alpha male to describe themselves that way. That's because they don't. I think my girlfriend would die from laughter if I described myself as an alpha male and I looked at myself as being on top of the dominance hierarchy. I try my best to have my actions reveal a high level of value and virtue. To those who may feel like I'm being too harsh, and to those who believe his pitifully weak performance concerning his wife's illness is normal, let me say this. Everyone remembers the recession from 2007 to 2008. In addition to the recession, let me tell you what I remember during that time. I was present when my wife's kidneys were failing, and I was present during her dialysis. I was present when she had a heart attack during the dialysis, and I read to her every day while she was in a coma. And I was present for her last breath, and I was present to comfort her two children, which were my stepchildren. Then I planned every part of the funeral. The next Saturday, I worked from 7 a.m. to noon, and I went to the wake at 2 p.m. On Sunday, I worked from 7 a.m. to noon, and then I went to my wife's funeral. I picked all the music, the scripture, and I delivered the eulogy. Soon after the funeral, both children went back to their biological father. So yes, I lost both of them too. Throughout this, I didn't miss any days of work. I performed all of my responsibilities the best I could. And I never even thought to turn to psychotropic medications. At that time, I would have taken medications if there was a drug that would have given me my family back, but no such drug exists. Since then, I have lost my mother, and I have lost my father, and rarely does a day go by that I don't miss them. I've had a few dogs that needed to be put down to free them from their pain, and I never left them until their souls were released. This is all part of legitimate suffering. Feeling all of it, while being physically and emotionally present throughout it all, displays love, honor, and respect for life. And it's a final thank you for being an important part of my life. I am in total agreement with Carl Jung, who would say that Jordan Peterson's depression and anxiety issues are a result and a substitute for his irresponsibility in not being able to fully experience his legitimate suffering. Thus, his needless suffering has increased for him and his family. The drugs are a way to combat the symptoms or the result, but do absolutely nothing to address the root causes. Addressing the root cause is something that is necessary and is an example of legitimate suffering, but Peterson doesn't seem to be ready to take this route. Processing feelings has never killed anyone, but masking feelings has killed millions. I think that's far too much needless suffering. Through my marriage and family therapist lens, I have gone over much of Peterson's work, and it's a good way to get insight about him because you can't separate the art from the artist. Every word gives impressions and clues. But his body of work reminds me of a review of the band Yes, if you remember them. It was a long time ago, and I read it in Rolling Stone magazine. The reviewer said that the band was almost perverse in its insistence to never play basic blues scales or chords which is the very foundation for almost every rock band. Well, looking through Peterson's work, it's almost perverse that he spends almost no time on unresolved childhood trauma issues, which is the cause for almost all mood and personality disorders, and is the very foundation of talk therapy. Unlike the band Yes, Jordan Peterson can't work his way around the foundation. The way forward is the legitimate suffering of working on the root cause, which is usually childhood trauma. Denial of this causes neuroticism and more needless suffering, even for people such as Jordan Peterson. I'm Joe Perroni from the Rise Above Project. I hope you like today's show. Please subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you.